who are some of your favorite famous rivalries throughout history, non-tattooing related?
Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be up there. I don't know. I'm a lover, not a fighter. You know, so like rivalries. Like, you know, I always find them a bit staid. Who are you thinking of?
Oh, see, I'm different because I'm a born hater. So a personal favorite is Courtney Love versus everyone. I fall on the side of Courtney Love. A lot of these sort of things is women
Byron
versus
Shelley.
Well, I was going to say is women versus everyone. So my favorite, obviously, being Sinead O'Connor versus everyone, and every single time Sinead O'Connor was right. But yeah, it's like, yeah, I think when you boil it down, that the competitive impulse in artists generally is a good and a bad thing.
Mutually productive and antagonism, right? Like that seems to be probably the right thing.
Yeah, rather than Ink Master, maybe we should get tattoo artists in a boxing ring to actually like physically sort out their problems.
Yeah, but all of them have got really weak wrists, haven't they? So they'd all be. I don't know.
All the cartilage in every tattooer's hands is destroyed. Their wrists
they've all got carpal tunnel syndrome and like bad backs.
Yeah. Maybe that's what we should invent a front supporting chair like they use for doctors for tattoo artists. Doesn't look cool, but it's good for you.
I think rivalries is a really good. There's that new Jilly Cooper series on Disney Plus, isn't there, called Rivals? So, you know, with a bit of love, a bit of hate, a bit of sex.
I keep getting ads for it on TikTok
because you're so young.
Yeah, but today we're going to be talking about, what you can probably see from the title, is the other half in a very famous tattooing rivalry, one that we covered the other half for years ago at this stage.
Maybe as we're going to, it might even be a polycule, right? This might be a three-way.
Mm-hmm. A polycule of hate. A polycule. This is the best polycule. It's a polycule of hate and mutual respect, you know? Just because you don't like someone doesn't mean you can't respect them. That's a joke from me and Matt based on the conversation we had before we were recording. You know who you are, who I'm talking about.
Or are we the Penn and Teller of podcasting, Tom?
Penn and Teller didn't like each other. They like
exactly,
yeah, but I like you. You know, you're my friend.
Yeah, I like you too.
That's how you keep good, successful business relationships going, is having a mutual respect for each other's professionalism and skill above being friends. Anyway, you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything, told through the history of tattooing. I am one half of this hateful polycule that is just two people, Thomas O'Mani, and I'm joined by the other half, Dr. Matt Lauder.
Yeah, you are Teller, I am Penn. You are the talented one, and I am the loud, mouthy one.
I feel like that goes back and forth depending on the day.
Yeah, so we're talking about rivalries, right? Like one specific rivalry. The rivalry. Well, this is maybe, to introduce it, this is probably a good way to do it. This is a rivalry's going well when you have to take out a public notice. You know, in the days before Instagram, you had to put things on the front page of the newspapers. This was in amongst other newspapers syndicated in the Yorkshire Telegraph and Star, Wednesday evening, January the 4th, 1899. A little notice putting one party putting the other on blast. Right. Tattooed royalty, says the headline. The following advertisement appears in a London contemporary. Tattooed royalty. Read an article appearing in Christmas Magazine and St James's Gazette, 15th of December, 1898, so like a couple of weeks before. The only English tattooist with the knowledge and royal authority to make this contradiction. I beg to inform readers of that article but the illustrations purporting to be facsimiles of designs tattooed on HRH, the Duke of York, and HRH, Prince George of Greece, are absolutely false. SM Tattooist. So that is the equivalent of like an Instagram story shared widely across the English local newspaper press in early 1899 by SM Sutherland MacDonald, calling out Tom Reilly, who by MacDonald's claim at least was basically making it up who he tattooed. Because MacDonald, as we know, would never do that.
Yeah, as we have talked about in previous episodes, I think every tattooist probably before the year of, I don't know, 1965 was just an absolute liar about most things.
Yeah. So we're talking about...
When was truth invented, Matt?
About 5 minutes ago, I don't know. So we're talking about Victorian and Edwardian London. We're talking about Tom Reilly today.
And for anyone who wants a bit of background information or a bit of additional information about this time, go way back to one of our earliest episodes that we did about Sutherland MacDonald.
Yeah, I think we probably talk a bit about Tom as well, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, right, as you said, like this is a time when tattooing as an industry in England is in Britain is just starting out, and there is a kind of like interest in it in the public, and but every tattooist is really sort of scrambling for business and advertising and going in the paper, as we'll see, and sort of showing off your work and also claiming things that maybe aren't 100% true become a bit part of the standard repertoire, right? Because to get, as we've talked about on the show as well, like to get customers, you need to get in the paper, and you could pay for adverts. And as we'll talk about, Reilly and MacDonald and others did pay for adverts very frequently in newspapers and magazines. But also you could basically kind of convince a journalist to do a human interest story. And so finding little hooks for stories, claiming celebrity clients, et cetera, was a good way to kind of get in the papers. And of course, if you're in the papers as the named tattooer to the royal family, or royal families actually, across Europe, that's a good way to get your name and address in the papers and start driving the kind of client base which you actually have, which are broadly kind of upper middle class at this time, people with money and leisure time and taste. So maybe if you're not actually tattooing the king, but you might be tattooing members of the House of Lords or captains in the army or their sons and occasionally daughters. So the article that MacDonald was complaining about, and MacDonald himself advertised himself also really without any evidence as tattooer to the royal family, because the Duke of York then, who's the man who'd go on to be King George V, was tattooed in Japan, and that was well known. That had been one of the driving forces for tattooing beginning as an industry. And MacDonald made quite a lot of hay that he had also tattooed George latterly, that when he came back. Now, again, quite interestingly, we've talked about this in the MacDonald episode, he would have on his business cards or sort of flyers, big lists of names with the king at the top, and then confidential. Like, don't tell anyone, but here's my clients, right? So this is marketing, right? Like we've been talking a lot just in general, you and I, Tom, about tattoo marketing and the saturation of the industry and everyone angling for business in a time when business is slow or there's more artists than customers. And this was a good strategy, right?
Oh, well, this is this goes back to the continuity of marketing from its kind of proto form pre 1950s and the formalization of the advertising industry, that one of the best ways to get advertising is to have beef with someone else or to cause some form of controversy, like saying you tattooed a royal. But also as well, the best way for a lot of these people who are doing, I suppose you could call them trade crafts at the time, so we're talking Victorian into the Edwardian era, is to get into the newspapers either as curios or small column stories. At the time, obviously, there was the massive explosion in rates of literacy, particularly in Britain. Lots of people were reading the morning or the afternoon edition or the evening edition of the paper, And
Yeah.
these were how you would reach people who wouldn't necessarily be around you or interact with circles that you ran in.
And magazines so the article that McDonald was complaining about was published in a magazine called Harmsworth.
Mm-hmm.
And Harmsworth was kind of a illustrated magazine of general human interest stories, really, published monthly. And yeah, there was a whole ecosystem of newspapers and newspaper owners publishing magazines, and they would seek subscribers. And it was a whole and tattoo stories at the time, right, made a great combination of things, because you got to have a little bit of royal gossip.
Mm-hmm.
You got to have some photographs which were quite salacious, sometimes of women without many clothes on.
Mm-hmm.
But they also obviously wrapped up in Orientalism and colonialism, lots of discussion of the Orient and the Far East, etc. The Orient in quotes there, as they called it at the time. So tattoo stories, I mean, still today, you see tattoo stories all the time. I mean, every single day I get them on my newsfeed, and probably this is this show too. It's a good slow news day, a good kind of, oh my God, what are people doing to themselves? Pearl clutching story, or the flip side of, isn't this cool and interesting? And that really has been a staple of how tattooers put themselves in the world, but also how newspapers and now websites sell adverts is talk about tattooing.
And also, if you think that the contemporary age of the tattoo controversy article has gone by, you only have to look at in relatively recent years the example of the photos of the King of Thailand's tattoos circulating around, and the furor around that, both in Thailand and the surrounding region. This is, it's good. Paper never refuses ink, and a slow news day never refuses a bit of fluff.
Yeah, exactly. So this article, as I said, was published in Harmsworth. It's called "Tattooed Royalty: Queer Stories of a Queer Craze." It's one of the appearances of our favorite Hokusai frog, which we did a whole episode about,
which I have a tattoo of now.
Which you have a tattoo of now. And it says, amongst other things, anyone meeting the Duke of Newcastle or the Earl of Portarlington or Sir Edmund Lechmere in the street would hardly realise the fact that these gentlemen are proud wearers of tattoo marks. Very much so. We're able to give facsimiles of the designs which have been tattooed on the Duke of York, Prince Francis of Teck, who was the, I think, brother-in-law of the king. I think she was Mary of Teck's brother. He was Mary of Teck's brother. Prince George of Greece, together with other examples of the art. Professor Reilly's work is pronounced to be, by no less than a celebrated Royal Academician who takes considerable interest in tattoo work, the finest in the world. The present fancy for being tattooed, according to Professor Reilly, than whom no artist has tattooed more distinguished people, mainly exists among men who've travelled much, with ladies also taking a liking to this form of personal decoration, which, from a woman's point of view, is about as expensive as dress, but not so costly as good jewellery. Right, we're going to do an episode about tattoo pricing, and I think that's quite a good turn of phrase. You can see, Tom, why McDonald was pissed off about that, because he definitely also claimed to have tattooed the high society and probably had more of a claim to have done so.
But the thing that's really interesting about this, and the tone of hearing that, is that even well over 100 years ago, there's still this kind of struggle for legitimacy in how it's spoken about, in that its association with the royals give it this kind of air of grace, and that the polite and right members of society are doing it, so it must be not for quote unquote savages anymore.
Yeah, and you're right. This sort of media campaign style that Reilly and others were involved in was also a lot about legitimacy, about please take us seriously. The use of that term professor, which we find really in the first ever adverts for tattooers in England are calling themselves professors, as a way to sort of distinguish themselves, and also comparing, talking about themselves as artists, with the stamp of approval of the Royal Academy. And here, I'm going to ask you to Google this, and because it'll make you laugh. So they talk about some of the tattoos that he did, and for example, he talks about, as we might take stuff off of Instagram, the Victorians and Edwardians were taking stuff of famous art at the time. A man, says Harmsworth magazine, may admire a favourite picture and desire a reproduction of it tattooed on his back or upon his chest. Professor Reilly is at this present time engaged in etching on a man's back Landseer's famous picture, Dignity and Impudence. And when it's finished, it will measure 12 by 9 inches. Can you Google for me Landseer, Edwin Landseer, the British artist, Dignity and Impudence, and tell the listeners whether it would make a sick back piece or not?
For those who are listening and aren't Googling, it is a beautiful painting of two dogs.
Yeah, a big floppy dog and a tiny little yappy dog.
Yeah, that's us.
Yeah, dignity. Who's dignity and who's impudence?
I think you know the answer to
that. So yeah, so you can see there like the kind of game that Reilly's playing, right? He wants to be sort of taken seriously as a man who's got high clients, who's engaged in the kind of high artistic world, and also, you know, as a kind of like, you know, a sort of proper figure of London life. Professor Reilly has never done anything more striking or effective, if perhaps we accept the large snake he tattooed around the body of a popular member of the royal family, which is an extremely lifelike reptile. So you can see there the little wink. There are over 100,000 people in London who bear on some part of their anatomy evidence of the tattooing needle. I doubt. I mean, that's probably an overestimation, but I love that wink of like, yeah, a member of the royal family is very popular. I'm not going to tell you who, but wink, wink. Completely unprovable, right?
But I think let's take a step back for a second and talk about what we know about Reilly's early life and his journey to being a tattoo artist.
Yeah, so he was a difficult man to find much out about, actually, because Thomas Reilly is a really common name in the Victorian period. So his early life was very difficult to make sense of. The work that did really crack the story was the work of Carmen Nissen, who's Bert Grimm's niece, a rare niece in the pantheon of nephews that we know. Carmen Nissen, who wrote an amazing website called Buzzworthy Tattoo History, that's now on hiatus a bit, but she did some work on Ron Reilly's life, and also assisted by Rich Hardy, who's an amazing kind of aficionado and collector of Edwardian Victorian stuff. And then Terry Manton, who we know listens to the show. Hi, Terry. Also did some amazing work on putting Tom's stories together. So, interestingly enough, right, so Tom Reilly, in the sort of when the rivalry between Reilly and MacDonald is written about, MacDonald's written about as Scottish and Reilly's written about as Irish, but actually both of them were born in Leeds. So yeah, so Reilly gets written about as Irish and MacDonald as Scottish, although both of them are born in Leeds, of all places. There's a lot of misconception about Reilly, actually, because in George Burchett's quote unquote autobiography, Memoirs of a Tattooist, which again, as we've talked about on the show, isn't an autobiography, it says that Tom Reilly is related to Samuel O'Reilly in New York, and that is not true at all.
We're not all related. Like,
all related. Well, this was the work of a lazy journalist in the 1950s has really corrupted a lot of tattoo history. But so Reilly, not Irish, but from Leeds. He's about 10 years younger than MacDonald, about 8-9 years younger than MacDonald. He was born in 1872 or thereabouts. And he was born. His birth name is Thomas Clarkson, and he takes the name Tom Reilly from his sister, who was called Sarah, who was married to a man called Jim Reilly. So, for some reason, we don't know and is unclear, he took as his name as early as his military service in the Boer War, which was after he was already a tattooer. In the 1890s, and there's some photos of him tattooing whilst at war. He took the name of his sister's, the surname of his sister's husband. So it's a bit unclear about why that might be, but the way that was solved was a bit of sort of genealogical genius by Carmen, who sort of found this connection through looking at his Boer War military records. So Tom Clarkson. Later, Tom Reilly was born to a bricklayer. His father was a bricklayer and a railway porter. And again, already this sort of marks him out as quite different to MacDonald, right? MacDonald was the child of a school teacher and a Turkish bath proprietor, a much more sort of middle class profession. And so the rivalry is sort of set here where Reilly's a bit younger, a bit rougher around the edges. They're both from sort of the same part of the world. MacDonald, in my opinion, is clearly a kind of better technical tattooer, but Reilly's a bit more of a showman, a bit more of an extrovert. There was, as I mentioned the other day, at one point discussions about adapting one of my exhibitions or part of my exhibition into a TV series, like Peaky Blinders style, which was going to be based around the rivalry between MacDonald and Reilly in the early 20th century. I just think would have been fun. But yeah, so he apprenticed as a bricklayer. All of this is coming from Carmen's work. And then, ended up basically enlisting into the West York Regiment in 1889, and then with the Argyll Sutherland Highlanders, these regiments of the British Army. And he'd been tattooed a bit, but basically when he got into the army, he realised that tattooing was his sort of calling, and he ended up, like a lot of soldiers did at the time, in Aldershot, basically. In the town where Jesse Knight would go on to be a very famous tattooer, where MacDonald has got his start as well, where there was a lot of people. And before really opening up in London, he was in Liverpool, he was in Glasgow for a while. He ended up into the early 1890s becoming working in Wales and doing kind of performing shows. He was in Hull for a bit as well, traveling around, working out of ports, doing small level stuff, and probably inspired, again, as Carmen says, probably inspired by MacDonald, whose work by that point was getting a lot of press. So Reilly is really kind of emerging from the military tattoo tradition at a time when that was possible for the first time, right?
And also as well, really, I think the difference between Reilly and MacDonald really shines through in that origin, that Reilly is coming from much more of the military tattooing tradition, whereas MacDonald, I suppose, being afforded the comfort of coming from a middle class background, I'm going to work on these much larger pieces because of the economic factors influencing it.
So MacDonald had obviously been a military tattooer as well. He'd also learned to tattoo in the army, but his career post Aldershot was managing the hammam Turkish baths in London, a job which he'd got clearly because he'd grown up in a Turkish bath that was run by his parents. And so he had a job, he had income, he had a career, which, as you said, got sort of afforded him, and also he had access to these immediately much more upper class clients because they were the people coming to the Turkish bath at the time. Whereas Reilly is, he's although, as we said, has a pretense to a more higher class client base, is having to hustle for a slightly better, slightly more refined version of the sailor tattoo, right? And he performing tattoo men, we didn't ever have the same kind of sideshow culture as America did in Britain, but tattooed men and women had been performing in sort of Victorian music halls and stuff since at least the 1870s. One of the important places in London, the London Aquarium, which we'll come to in a bit, I suppose, was the key place for music hall performances, and Reilly had the booth there. But he's trying to sort of mop up, I suppose, certainly when he comes to London, mop up the clients at the slightly lower end of the market than MacDonald was.
Also, as well, I suppose, the evidence we do have of Reilly's work, it isn't as, I suppose, extensive in terms of coverage of the body. They're not, a lot of the pieces aren't as full fronts, full backs, full sleeves. It seems much more contemporaneous with what we think of a sleeve now, as kind of pieces put together over time.
Yeah, little bangers, and because that was cheaper, right? With MacDonald, as we talked about on the episode, people were coming to him for huge back pieces and paying him the equivalent of like sometimes more than a year's salary, right, to get a whole back piece is done over the course of several months. Reilly did have some clients, including famously his wife Florence Flo, who called herself the Living Art Gallery, who were very heavily tattooed, but as you said, largely, although exclusively, with these smaller pieces. Although often a mix of the traditional sort of sailor tattoos, but also stuff from Japan. And as we said, he was drawing on hokusai and traditional and popular Japanese prints at the time.
And I suppose as well, if you were to kind of infer something to it, this could have also been a contributing factor between the rivalry between the two, is that the differences in approach towards the work they're doing on their clients. Like McDonald is afforded the opportunity of doing mostly these large scale bodies of work, pieces of work on bodies, whereas Reilly, it seems a bit more hard scrabble.
Yeah, 100%. And you can see that. I mean, you can imagine, right? So he's working at these out of waxwork museums and dime shows, and then eventually, as we'll come to, at the Royal Aquarium. And that is a hard gig because Flo, his wife, is performing, right, by which she's sort of telling tales and showing off her body and showing off her tattoos. And then Reilly's basically got to get the crowd before and after the show to queue up for tattoos afterwards. So it's a real hustle. It is a real hustle, and it's a much less refined. McDonald had constructed for him what I have argued is the first professional purpose-built tattoo studio in the world, right? Because he had enough clients that he could basically build a private studio for himself. Reilly is working, alongside Flo in Manchester Hotel, in Birmingham, at like Cornelius's Waxwork Museum in Glasgow, at the American Museum in Liverpool. Like, he's working in these sort of circus establishments. And actually, he did in 1896. He did a run at a venue called Wonderland in Whitechapel. Loads more about this in Terry's book, which I really, really recommend, which is called "The Pioneers of British Tattooing." We're going to have him on the show when our diaries can line up.
Also, as well, Terry Manton has beautiful handwriting. Is something that I didn't know.
He was a professional he was a professional sign writer for a long time.
Yeah. So it's something I didn't really realize until I got the copy of the book that he so kindly sent me, and it was like, oh, his handwriting. As someone who has terrible handwriting, Terry, you have beautiful, beautiful handwriting.
So Reilly, he also occasionally used the name Thomas Osmond Moore, Tom, right? It's also a bit unclear.
Just like me. It's just like me. Yeah, I'm also Tom in name and acronym. This was
Terry's discovery. In 1896, he basically worked for 6 weeks at the Wonderland in Whitechapel, and then ended up working at the Royal Aquarium, where I think he was probably one of his most important spots. He had a sort of studio space for a while in the centre of London, and he even briefly sort of tattooed at World's Fairs and things like that. Advertised himself at the World's Fair in London, but it was at the Royal Aquarium that he really kind of like held his own. And I think, again, this is a kind of interesting difference between him and McDonald, right? So when McDonald is working in the hammam bath in this private studio space, it's very luxurious. Tom Reilly's working in the Royal Aquarium. And that sounds weird, right? Because you imagine like aquariums is where fish are, right? Of course. And the Royal Aquarium is so interesting because it was initially built to be an aquarium, right? Like, it was built, I think, in the 1860s. Let me check that exactly. But basically, it was built to 1876. It was built, and it was meant to be this, basically sort of place of high Victorian education, and it would be a place for where you could go and see fish and tropical gardens, botanical gardens. But it turns out there's not a lot of money, even in the 19th century. There's nothing on telly to showing people fish, and so very, very quickly, the owners of the aquarium realised that they had to kind of put on a better show than just some fish in tanks. And they initially started doing restaging of famous naval battles in miniature in the tanks, which would have been incredible.
We need to bring that back. I want to see that.
Right, with like full cannon things, and they brought in seawater. They did display a dead whale in 1877.
Yeah, just in case you forgot, it's the 1870s. They would do stuff like that.
Yeah, they had this incredible, like, a huge hall, art gallery, restaurants. There was a skating rink, a theatre, really importantly, and so it became essentially a place for, like, music hall, really, like quite low rent, quite mass market entertainment. Right, it was massive, like 340 foot long by 160 feet wide, so 100 meters by 50 meters. The main hall with palm trees, fountains, this incredible space. And the performing ladies became a really important. Well, performing initially men. So if any of you have heard of Captain Constantinos, the Greek performing man, he was performing there. A guy called John Williams, a British guy who'd learned to tattoo in America around the same time McDonald was starting in the early 1880s, tattooed there. But tattooed women became a real draw. And in fact, the whole place became known for prostitution, sex work, in general, right? It was a place if you were a sex worker, you could go and pick up some clients. There was like circus and singing and all kinds of like mad, like popular theatre. But Flo Reilly basically had her show there as the living gallery of Japanese art, young, pretty, and refined. And actually, until recently, we've not seen a photo of her, or we've not known of a photo of her. There had been a photo of her that we hadn't identified, but a handbill, which Darren Bray recently sold through his auction, came up for sale to sort of really confirm who she was. But she was this living gallery of Japanese art performing at the Royal Aquarium. And the Royal Aquarium became such an important spot, right, for Reilly. Although, again, it's a bit unsalubrious. So here's a couple of news stories from the aquarium. One is headlined, Boys Aquarium Spree. 7 Battersea boys were charged, this is 1898, were charged with stealing £30, which is a fucking lot of money, belonging to Charles Cole, a pensioner. They were spending the money freely at the aquarium. And witnesses took one of them aside and questioned him. The boy confessed he'd stolen £30 from an old man who lived in his father's house. One day they all went to Southend, then they went to the aquarium and spent several pounds there, including £3 to a tattooist. Each of the boys were beautifully tattooed on the arms, and Slade, the boy, whose arm bore a particularly elaborate design, said he paid £1 for the operation. Detectives took them into custody and managed to find £11 on them. So they spent like 25 quid, which is a lot of money, on getting tattooed, and presumably that was Reilly. Just going to the aquarium, watching all the cute, cool shows, like some Bitcoin, those Bitcoin idiots that got caught recently. Teenagers get loads of money. The first thing they think to spend it on is like booze and clubs,
booze, porn, nothing and tattoos.
Changed. Yeah, so these kids were between 15 and 16, right? And they just went and had a beautiful day out at the aquarium, which I love a lot. And then the other there it is. So this is from this gives you a sense of how important this spot was. This is from 1898 as well, about the same time. Tom Reilly, tattooist, was summoned for threatening Alfred South at the Royal Aquarium. Alfred South is like the third of the London tattooists. He was an Austrian guy who'd moved to England.
Mm-hmm.
Up to May 16th, defendant Reilly rented a stall at the Royal Aquarium, but was asked to vacate it, and South took over. From the day the complainant entered the place, defendant had persistently threatened him. On July 6th, defendant visited the aquarium and made use of such threats that Mr. South felt compelled to take out a summons. Reilly waited until complainant South left the building, then flourished the summons and did his utmost to create a scene. Oh, you've got a summons, have you, Alf? Right. Being apprehensive of bodily harm, South asked that the defendant should be bound over to keep the peace. The complainant and 2 young ladies were called and bore out what had been said by counsel. the complainant, so South, said he'd been a tattooer for 18 months, a professional, not an amateur.
Mhm.
Amateur in point of time, one might pick up in time. You're definitely inferior of the defendant in your business. Complainant did not admit this. So Reilly's fucking lawyer was like, yeah, but you are shit though, Alf. and Alf has to deny that in open court, which I think's funny. I mean, Alfred South is definitely not the best draftsman. We'll do a separate episode about him. He did not know that South said he did not know the defendant had a lucrative business at the aquarium for 2.5 years and did not enter in negotiations with him for the purchase of his connection. Defendant approached him saying he had some trouble with his wife who wanted to poison herself. And so he better clear out. Complainant had certainly not offered a larger rent for the stall than defendant had. He might have written to the defendant to the effect the latter had used terms he dare not repeat to his face. William Finney, the high diver at the aquarium, said he was standing in the bar on one occasion when with the complainant, with South, when the latter said he was prepared to fight Reilly for all he was worth. The only condition was that Reilly must deposit his money at the Sporting Life office. After hearing other witnesses, he ordered defendant to enter 5 shillings to keep the peace. Right. So if you follow that, essentially, Reilly's apparently having some bother with his missus. And so South comes in and says to the boss, like, if you don't want this drama, I'll buy the pitch off you for more money. And if he wants to offer me out, I will fight him. And the high diver is like sort of pulling them apart, you know, calm down, Alf, he's not worth it. I will fight him. He must put his deposit into Sporting Life offices. So you really get the sense, right, that pitch, right, the most lucrative pitch for popular tattooing in all of London is so lucrative that these guys are outbidding each other and getting into fist fights and having like public brawls in order to defend their pitch.
Fuck's sake.
Right? Whose side are you on there? I do love the fact that Reilly's lawyer's like, you're not very good, are you? And Alf has to say, no comment.
I have to go with Reilly, just the showmanship of the defense. Just like, well, you're not that good. Fuck off.
Yeah, you call yourself a tattooer, mate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know. I think that's a good insight into the period, right? Like it is quite flamboyant, you know, and it shows how sort of cutthroat, if you like, the whole business is. I should also say, you know, in terms of showmanship, go on. This rivalry was so intense, the three of them, South, Reilly, and McDonald, that they would advertise in the same newspapers, like next to each other. One of them would say, I tattoo in 5 colours, then it would be 6 colours the next week, and then all colours. They would, as we said right at the beginning of the episode, like slag each other off to the press. Like there was not a lot of love lost between any of them. And they would, you know, they'd be taken to do stunts. So Reilly claimed, although I've never found any evidence that this actually happened, so I'm pretty sure it was just a claim. He claimed that he tattooed a water buffalo in Paris, and I would have thought if that was true, there'd be photographs of it, or there would be
100%
mentions of it in the French press at the time, and there isn't. South, by contrast, like got into a tiger cage and said he got attacked by a tiger because he was tattooing the tiger tamer while the tiger was there, because he had to get a good likeness of the tiger. Right? All of this is stunts for the press, right? It's to get in the press, it's to get yourself in the papers, in people's consciousness as the tattooist to go to. And the other thing that Reilly did that's really important, actually, for tattoo history is one of the things that, as we've said, you know, a lot on the show, one of the real driving forces for rich people getting tattooed was this fascination for Japan. And Reilly gave a job to a Japanese tattooer, this guy called Hori Toyo, who had come over to Liverpool, been at some point so poor that he was in a workhouse up in Liverpool, but claimed at least to have been this incredible tattooer. And he worked, you know, everyone else is claiming to be doing Japanese tattoos, but Reilly's got his own in-house tattooer. And Hori Toyo did then go on to work in New York and San Francisco. anything to get yourself in the papers, right? As I said, he was working at Earl's Court for shows. He tattooed dogs. So there's a photo of him tattooing a fox terrier.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we don't know a lot about him as an artist per se, right? A lot of the photographs we have of his work are things copied from Japanese Flash, potentially. Like I found that as far as we knew, there was no surviving paintings by him or Flash by him. But I did discover randomly in Portsmouth, when my exhibition was there, a duck, as you said, based on a painting by this ornithological artist called Archibald Thorburn, which was labelled Tom Reilly 1911. And since then, in the George Birchett collection in Lyle Tuttle's and some of the things that have come out of that, there are basically those drawings of the things that he claimed to be on the royal family. A lot of those ended up in the George Birchett collection somehow. So there are a couple of paintings of his, but he's not doing these incredible kind of like large scale bodysuits like MacDonald was. The other famous client of his, I suppose, that's worth mentioning is this woman called Princess Chimay, who was an American who married into the Belgian royal family, and she had a snake on her arm. But yeah, like he was definitely a bit more of a, MacDonald's public image was always one of like refinement, and Reilly tried that, but it didn't really stick. So his public presentation is really one of like a bit more of a showman. He did sort of call himself a society tattooist, and did sort of claim to tattoo wealthy people, but really, 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 he's the guy tattooing in the circuses.
But that's probably why it lends to, I suppose, so much stuff that we have surviving of him being a showman, is that he had to graft a lot more to get clients.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see that as the graft, that's the business. I mean, again, we talked about it a lot, the idea of tattooers having to stand out, right? And in the days before Instagram, in the days before magazines, like, this is how you did it. He's an interesting guy because he also sort of disappeared a bit, right? Like, he sort of faded away. He had a couple of apprentices, one of whom is called Jim Wilson, who became a pretty interesting tattooer in his own right, and is probably, if people have seen photos of Reilly's work, it's probably on Jim Wilson and Wilson's wife Annie. But he sort of disappears, partly again because Reilly is a difficult name to trace, but as best we can tell, he ends up in Nottingham in the 1920s, and that is confusing, really. We don't really know why he ended up in Nottingham. He did break up with Flo. He did at some point divorce Flo, and so whether it was because of that, who knows? But yeah, he ends up working in this sort of little back street in the 1920s in Nottingham, and it's a bit ignominious, really. Like, MacDonald, is well known and fairly famous right up until his death. George Birchett very quickly eclipses the other two as the most famous tattooer in London. Reilly is not really capitalizing on the 20s boom of tattooing. In fact, as I said before, then he seems to have disappeared. He marries another woman called Florence, called Florence Goodley, and he worked as a theatre painter. So yeah, it's very strange to think of the sort of downfall of this. And again, as best we can tell, like, he ended up about 50 years old, twice married, twice separated, by Terry's words, back up in Leeds. And yeah, it's difficult to really say much about the end of his career, but he was tattooing right up until the 1930s, but in Hull, right? Just tattooing in a back room, in a boarding house / brothel on Queen Street in Hull. Reilly got, again by Terry's research, got a pauper's funeral, alone with no family around him, and it's quite sad. As I said, there's lots of holes still in his life, but MacDonald had a bit of a tragic life. Also had a child die, and very sad sort of fairly comfortable life. Reilly, as right to the end, was tattooing, but scrabbling about. Right. Look, he really wanted to be taken seriously, right? And he really wanted to be, Tom Reilly, the society tattooist. He wanted to be just like McDonald. It's clear that he kind of envied him a little bit, right? But for whatever reason, it just didn't quite work out that way. And McDonald's there. I mean, yeah, even in the 1920s, McDonald's writing letters saying that business is quiet and the style of stuff he was doing wasn't particularly fashionable, and his business was slow in the 1920s and 30s. But Reilly, as it disappears completely because he's just sort of doing very unglamorous tattooing back up in Yorkshire in a way that takes him completely off the radar of the London set, And I think you can see, I think it's interesting, right, that this guy who was one of the most famous tattooers in the world for a while just ends up being sort of completely out of fashion and as I said, divorced, maybe with a kid. Like Terry discovered that he had a child with him, but it's unclear whether it was his or one of his second wife Florence's children from a previous marriage. Like, it's very difficult to know much about his life. As I said, Terry's sort of done the most recent work on that. But I think it's a good illustration of how you can be, top of the tree, and one day, and then the next day you're completely gone. You vanished from popular consciousness. And he was clearly kind of a flash, kind of, as I said, kind of a showman, a bit certainly younger and certainly more handsome and certainly more kind of dashing than McDonald. But just it wasn't sustainable for whatever reason. I don't know why you think that might have been.
I think I think the thing is that, like, Sutherland MacDonald kind of suffered the exact same fate as him. Like, at the end of the day, is that, artists falling into obscurity when their style falls out of favor and society kind of moves on.
Yeah, you're right. Although McDonald got obituaries in the major London newspapers and was still having features about him into the 1930s.
But is that because of Sutherland MacDonald himself, or because of his clientele that he tattooed being attached much more to the type of people involved in society who write these obituaries?
That's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Right. Like, it's and the point, I think, of this is that these two things are tied up together. Right. The celebrity tattooer and their client base are forever intertwined. Right.
And I think it's an interesting statement on, like, as tattooers, does it, do you matter more because of who you tattoo, and are you remembered by history because of who you tattooed rather than your art or your contribution, or do you matter more because history remembers the people who you tattooed?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. There's lots of tattooers now who have very famous clients, and that's probably the case, right? And it's interesting. There was we joke about this all the time. 1925. So Reilly's still alive at this point, although, as I said, kind of faded into obscurity. Jim Wilson, his apprentice, gave an interview, and he was like, "Tattooing's over now. Tattooing's dead. The art's dead, and it's really too bad." Right. So Jim Wilson, who was by this point tattooing in America in Brooklyn, he longs for the days when, and describes the modern lack of taste in tattooing. He's like, tattooing has gone downhill. Tattooing's not cool anymore. Tattooing's not like artistic anymore in 1925. And he says, so Jim Wilson says, did he not have a stall at the Brussels exhibition and again at the Earl's Court exhibition? Well, he did. Was tattooing not considered an art in England? It was. It's just too bad. Fully as many folks want themselves decorated with serpents and anchors and ships and bouquets now as ever, but their tastes aren't as aesthetic. Right. And he basically says, like, Tom Reilly was a real artist, right?
But it's so interesting, and that, like, within the story of both Sutherland MacDonald and Tom Reilly as individuals, and the story of their rivalry and careers, and I suppose their fade into irrelevance, contains this kind of timeless story that we've seen repeat itself over and over again, and seeing right now is like, do you position yourself as this kind of artisan catering to a specific clientele? Do you become a grafter and tattoo anyone you can? do you become a showman to try and get eyes on yourself? And we're 144 years onwards, and tattooing is still fighting the same fight that they were to be seen as a legitimate art form.
Yeah, and there's still tattoo. As I said, like Jim Wilson says, there was real shading and design back in the day, right? Like it was better in the olden days, right? When tattooing was artistic and serious, and now everyone just wants, there's more people are getting tattooed, but they're not serious about it. It's so funny that people are saying that 100 years ago.
And it's this thing where, the saying is like, oh, you die twice. You die when you die, and then you die when someone says your name for the last time. It's like when you're an artist, it's the inverse. It's like your first death is when your work falls into obscurity and no one cares anymore, and then you die.
Yeah.
Sorry to end the episode on a really morbid note.
Well, yeah, so you're right. Like, so in that Royal magazine, another article in the Royal magazine, he's called the most popular tattoo artist of the hour, encroaching on the domain claimed by other masters. He's yet a young man, well under 30, but speaks with an accent that proclaims his mother country. Presumably that means Ireland, but as I said, he was born in Leeds, so I don't know whether he was putting on an Irish accent. Who knows? But yeah, the man of the hour, right? And then now sadly forgotten. What is there in being tattooed, you might reasonably ask? It's only the fad of the idle. Well, no one knows what tomorrow may bring forth. Napoleon used to say nothing was more certain than the improbable. In a world which is crammed with unforeseen events, many of which are always happening when you least expect them, it may be your friend's fate to require identification tomorrow. Who knows? And then he says, Mr. Reilly tells me not long ago a man had a large-sized Christmas pudding tattooed on his chest simply for the fun of the thing. Right? So we're all going to die, or it's Christmas.
You're all going to die or your Christmas. And it's not that Riley's forgotten either, is that the people who know about him care about him. Like someone like Terry has done incredible work in keeping his memory alive and adding more color and detail to it through his research. And yeah, like a very fascinating and interesting artist. Like it's, I have a very Sutherland MacDonald, Tom Reilly snake and frog tattooed on my leg by Lorenzo Evangelista. And
both of them did versions of that. I mean, that's the other thing they did. They did versions of the same tattoo, like clearly trying to piss each other off.
But the thing is that like, the stuff might be forgotten, or forgotten feels like such a harsh word, but it's like in the mainstream consciousness of tattooing, irrelevant is maybe the word. But the people who care, like Lorenzo, Olivia Dawn, Samantha Fung, like, this stuff matters, and Nick York as well. This stuff matters, and they care, and they're doing great work in like keeping this stuff alive in a real, tangible sense that people are getting it. But it is a sad story that were they doing it too soon?
Yeah, well, but I think that they're the first. They have no models, right? They're the first generation of professional tattooers, right? In England, at least, there's no model for what tattooer looks like or how they present themselves, and so they are establishing Reilly MacDonald as a sort of two sides of the same coin, are setting out what tattooing looks like, and actually those rivalries between make it popular, keep it insider, do small bangers, do big back pieces, like those kind of tensions and rivalries and ways of being a tattooer, like still persist today, and they were figuring it out for the first time just by sheer force of will and personality. Like they were literally creating the mold that everyone else lives in to the present day, right?
It's the age-old saying of never be first, always be best. Because the people who do it first very rarely make any money or get enough credit from it. Never be your favorite artist's favorite artist.
Caution to this is from a Reilly ad. Caution to ladies and gentlemen thinking of being tattooed. First, see the work of 2 or 3 tattooists, then make the choice. See that a complete set of new needles are used, along with antiseptics, right? So check out the others, come to the best.
Exactly. And I suppose that is the end of the episode, as this is currently at time of recording going to be a Patreon episode. I'm sure we'll put it out on the free feed in the coming weeks or months. We have to thank our lovely patrons for supporting the show. This is a £5 and above episode, so thank you for everyone for being so generous. And also a very special thank you to our £10 and above patrons. If you're listening to this, do remember, if you are a £15 patron come November, you will be getting a signed copy of Matt's new book once it is released. But without further ado, I want to thank Morpheus Ravenna, Roy Hoxema, Chris Block, Charlie Lightning, Shit Jesus, Seb Lewis, Reed Forden, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Schick, Edub, Dylan, Casey Wardell, and Kaya Delos Reyes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to Terry Manton, Rich Hardy, and Carmen Nissen for really sort of cracking the code of Reilly's early and late life when he's sort of out of the newspapers, which is a very, very complicated piece of research. So really amazing. And pick up Terry's book, Professionals, Early Pioneers of British Tattooing, which is an absolutely phenomenal book.
Mm-hmm. And it is thank you and goodbye from me.
Bye.